This is a short presentation on the ATP PC system. What I'm going to do is explain what ATP is. ATP is made up of adenosine triphosphate. It's 1 part adenosine and 3 parts phosphate, as you see here. We have the adenosine here, and what the phosphates are held together by strong bonds represented by these lines. Now, it's the final bond that we are actually interested in. How the muscles actually get energy is the ATP actually breaks at this bond, giving off the energy. The energy that is given off by ATP is the only energy that is used by the muscles to actually produce movement. Now, once we've used all the ATP up, we're left with two products. We have ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, and you have a spare phosphate, which is here. Now, unfortunately, the body cannot use ATP and phosphate on its own. We can only use ATP. Now, unfortunately, in our muscles, ATP stores only last 2 seconds. Now, obviously, this is a problem in sport because we need to be able to exercise for longer than 2 seconds. So, we have a clever system, okay? This system is backed up with PC, which is known as phosphocreatine. The phosphocreatine is actually made up of a phosphate and a creatine molecule. Now, what happens here is when all the ATP is actually used up after 2 seconds of flat out exercise, our phosphocreatine breaks because that's held together by a bond. That energy then goes to recoupling our ADP, okay, our adenosine and the 2 phosphates, and our spare phosphate. So the energy goes into rebuilding this bond to create ATP. And once we've got our ATP back, we can reuse it again. Now, this system, the ATP PC system, only lasts 8 seconds. So in theory, we have 10 seconds worth of high intense energy. The first 2 seconds are used by the ATP stores, and the remaining 8 seconds is used by the ATP PC system. Now let's look at this slide to summarize. The whole process is called a coupled reaction. So we have adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP, is stored in the muscle. When we start exercising or doing any sort of movement, this bond breaks here. So once the bond breaks, it gives off what we call an exothermic reaction. It's like an explosion. It's really big, powerful, and it creates a lot of heat. That's why we get hot and sweaty when we exercise. So this bond breaks, the energy then goes to the muscle cell, and obviously then the muscle cell can move. Once the ATP stores are starting to get low, this triggers off a reaction via enzymes to break down the phosphocreatine. The energy from the phosphocreatine goes along to recouple our adenosine diphosphate, our ADP, with the spare phosphate that is lying around in the muscle cell. Once that is recoupled, we get ATP back again and we can use it. Unfortunately, it takes a little while to actually regenerate, or should we say resynthesize, the phosphocreatine. So the bond between the phosphocreatine is actually recoupled during recovery. Now, you can recover in different ways during exercise. Usually it is when the intensity levels actually become lower. So it might be, for example, after you've sprinted after a football, you've maybe put a cross in, you might jog slowly back, so the intensity levels have reduced, and you'll use glycogen and fats later on to help use the fuels to recouple those phosphocreatine stores. Now, this table actually summarizes what happens in the actual ATP PC system. So what happens is the ATP levels, they last about 2 seconds, as you can see here. Now, as soon as they start to dip, this triggers off a process of the phosphocreatine breaking down, giving off the energy to sustain this ATP level here. Now, as you can see, our phosphocreatine stores dramatically reduce, and they literally get exhausted after about 10 seconds. Okay, so what happens here is, by these phosphocreatine stores actually breaking down, our ATP levels are able to be sustained. So this could represent, for example, a 100-meter sprint where you're running flat out. So you started off the blocks, you're powering through, and our ATP levels are able to sustain. Therefore, we're able to keep on going with our top speed. After about 8 or 9 seconds, as you sort of start to finish off the 100-meter race, you will feel like you're starting to get that little bit slower. It's because our ATP stores are starting to reduce. Now, there was a sprinter years ago called Linford Christie, and he got interviewed by a journalist, and he actually asked Linford, why are you so fast at the end? Why are you faster than everyone else? And his reply was, I'm not faster than anyone else. I'm able to sustain my speed and everyone slows down. And in theory he was right, because if you look round about the 10-second mark, if you've got to be an absolute top quality sprinter to start, to sustain that all the way through and get underneath the 10-second mark. So you can see that they do start to slow down slightly when they get to the 10-second mark, and that's because the ATP levels are being exhausted. Now, the phosphocreatine stores will get regenerated later on during recovery. Now, in the next lesson, we actually look at what energy system takes over after 10 seconds, and that's known as the lactic acid system, and we'll look at that later on. So, to summarize, ATP is the main power cell. It generates a lot of energy, and we use that on a regular basis when we're doing short, sharp, intense exercise.